morning, and thank you so much to Brenda for that amazing session on the metaverse and some of the questions we need to talk about, creating something and hopefully a better verse, and I think we'll dig into that in a moment. But I just wanted to say thank you to the Beyond conference for putting something together for the last 2 days, which has been actually really, really insightful. The pandemic has really shaken us to a core in so many ways. It's it's shaken our cultures, our friendships, our finances, our health, and our mental health, which is a latent, slower effect. But I think we all need to take a real breath to look at how we can support ourselves and each other. And as Brenda just talked about so eloquently, we've turned to the metaverse quite quickly as a forcing function to kind of deal with this shock, almost like we've been thrown into the North Sea and we're swimming over to a life raft and hoping the metaverse is something we can cling on to help us not only now, but hopefully protect ourselves in the future of, a second pandemic or another way in the future. And the metaverse, is a difficult thing to describe, and everyone has lots of different ways of trying to communicate what it is. It is something as complex and difficult to understand as those early days of the internet, back in 70s and 80s. No one knew that the internet would turn into Instagram or Snapchat or TikTok back then. And so our ideas of what the metaverse may be now, are clouded and are only short-sighted to what we have in front of us. And I think we need to look at some of the bigger questions about it. And hopefully this session will do that. We need to talk about, why we want to build the metaverse, how we protect ourselves within it, some of the social impacts it could have on us, and some of the amazing topics that Brenda's just covered about identity, cultural identity, individualism, and everything else that could kind of come into it. So I hope we're going to have a session today to talk a little bit about those questions, maybe inspire a few people to take on the conversation downstream, but at least enable us all to question what we're going towards, and maybe impact it in a way that is more positive, or positive in the way that we feel it should be. So Beyond has pulled together an amazing panel for me to kind of talk with today. My name's Sol Rogers. I run a virtual production and innovation company called Rewind. We work in LA and London, and we've been very proud to work over the last 6 to 7 years creating immersive content for some of the biggest brands in the world. And I've also been very honoured to ask to chair BAFTA's Immersive Entertainment Group and also Immerse UK, hoping to inspire other people to use immersive technologies. The panel today has Ryan Gill. Hey, Ryan. Good morning.
Hello. Great to be here.
Ryan is co-founder of Crucible. He has 10 years leaning into technology, business, Bitcoin. Ryan Gill is the co-founder, visionaries of driving what Crucible is, and he's been taking a bold approach on work on avatars, on digital collectibles, digital layer trust, and really hoping to turn the metaverse into the open metaverse, defining and breaking those boundaries around what each of the different areas are that are being blocked away and becoming private. And I'm really looking forward to getting to what you mean there about what the open metaverse can and should be. We're also very kindly joined by Irina Shklovski. I hope I pronounced that correctly. I'm not too good with my accent, so I apologize if it came across wrong. And thank you so much for stepping in at the last minute. Irina, she straddles the interconnection between information sciences, communication studies, and human-computer interaction. Irina was the principal investigator on Virtue EU, which is specific values and ethics and responsibilities of technology in Europe. And I hope to hear some really interesting stuff about what your research has been. And obviously, Brenda, who, if you missed her, if you got up a little late, you've missed out. Her session was absolutely phenomenal about what the metaverse could and should be, and hopefully the betterverse would be. But just to touch on briefly, in case you missed it, BAFTA award-winning director, entrepreneur, artist, and has directed many games around the world and contributed to 50 titles under her own belt. And I'm sure we can hear a lot more from her. So I guess the first question and kind of topic to think about is, the metaverse has been talked about for many years, as you mentioned, Brenda. Maybe you can jump off. But as this new forming of it, the metaphors are becoming more explicit, and we are seeing versions or views into it in game engines, virtual worlds, and online currencies, what is the metaverse now, and how are people accessing its current flavor of it?
Well, I guess the metaverse now is what we sort of have always hoped it would be. I get, and not. I mean, it is a virtual. It's a virtual shared space where there's obviously a mix of reality here, where I'm at a table here, and we're all at our tables. We're watching this. Some of us are participating, some are participating in the chat. So we have this shared space where we can do the things that we need to do, but so that we can also socialize. Then the metaverse takes it one step further in that we are able to do things in the metaverse that we can't do, say, in the real world. Now, game worlds usually are at the forefront of this. Game worlds in science fiction are usually at the forefront of this in imagining what it is we could do or might like to do. But at this point in time, and it's not talked about as much because it's just not really terribly pleasant to talk about, the metaverse is still not for everybody. And the metaverse is for the people who designed it. The metaverse is a mirror of those people. Fortunately, it's engineered. It can be changed. I know it can be changed. But it's going to take some heavy lifting. And before that happens, people have to acknowledge that there are some significant problems with it.
Absolutely. Ryan, I know you've got your own take on it. And in fact, Crucible itself is really trying to become the fabric between different verses all held together. Can you talk a little bit about that kind of open approach and why you think that's important to bring what we currently have together?
Yeah, absolutely. So we come from a position of Web3, really. And so when we talk about the open metaverse, we kind of define it as user controlled and user generated. We're on the cusp of the next iteration of the way that the internet will work. And Web3 is a lot of network architecture right now, but it will give you control over your data. It will largely be decentralized. And so therefore, we really believe it's a renaissance, for people. It's just not as interesting for it to be the same companies that own more and more of it. It might be interesting for those companies and the shareholders, but it's not an opportunity for everybody. And I think from Web 2 to Web 3, you can kind of think of, Web 3 as Metaverse 1. That's how I like to consider it. So this is kind of another blank slate. And, we've passed through this portal of 2020 with COVID and the changes that we've gone through. And I think it is an opportunity to kind of reimagine things. And I think that the metaverse can be something that is collectively created. And so that's kind of how we think about it from the open perspective.
Absolutely. And I guess in terms of what, as you said, Brenda, what we are having in the space about being created for the people using it, which is not as inclusive or has as wide a representation as the richness of humanity on the planet. Irina, is there something we need to be careful about from your specific work in the past and your research studies?
Sure. I mean, I think when we think of the metaverse or its new inception of everybody being now part of it in some way or another, being forced to be on it and spending a lot of time in front of the screen, one of the things that I think need to think about is the fact that where in video games, I think there's a lot of choice, or at least some choice and control of what is made visible. In a Zoom session, there's a whole lot less of it. I see your background, you see mine. And so there are costs to being visible, to having deal with these new visibilities that are the requirements of participation, of having to expose yourself in different ways that have never been really the requirement before. So, I mean, that's part of just being part of the digital world. Digital world is all about exposing more and more and more, and that's the cost of participation. It's part of the reason for why we have concerns, why there's debates about privacy, why there's debates about data. And I'm extremely sympathetic to this idea of let's redo the whole thing. Let's make it decentralized. Let's give people control over their data, although whose own data is a different question. But at the same time, I think we also need to recognize just the sheer scale of the infrastructures that are built that are in private hands, that are essentially the underpinnings of everything that we're doing. And the amounts of control that very specific actors have about our ability to come together and do collective things, our ability to have this conversation. So there's, I think there is a conversation to be had about the kinds of infrastructures that we're building and the way these infrastructures need to be redone. And so there's a conversation to be had about the kinds of economic systems that enable these infrastructures and not others, alongside the conversation about what technologies we do and how we do them.
Well, so much of the technologies and gateways and portals into so many variants of what the metaverse are delivered through a corporation. They're delivered by someone who has profits that they need to meet in some way. So they always have this downward pressure onto all of the type of activity they're doing, from, you know, the openness of Facebook is a free platform for us to use and it gives you access to whatever, but we're the product within that. We've seen that through some of the recent articles that have come out, or Zoom itself is a platform to get into it. So everything kind of has this idea. And Ryan and I were talking yesterday about the idea of the public space, the gap between these corporation views. So is the same as I go down to central London, and I'm walking in central London, I'm in a public space which is not controlled by a corporation. It's controlled by the country, obviously, and the laws of that country. But as I step into the building, I'm now giving myself to whatever the company is that I'm walking through into that. And I think at the moment, we don't have those public spaces accessible. It feels like every gateway, be it through a game title or a Zoom platform or something like that, at the moment is very much a contractual, you know, engagement with someone who wants to make money from us. Within that, is there any way that we can expand that, or is there any kind of watch outs that we should look at about how that we can interconnect those spaces or put some controls onto those gaming platforms or those games or those interaction models or Facebook horizons?
I do think that there have been, going back to December 9th, 1993, there have been, that's when the video games were the subject of debate on the floor of Congress that exact day. And there have been controls. So I would say video games, you know, up to this point in time, they are, you know, they have ratings, what content you might find in them. But this new world and the you know, people coming online, there just really aren't those. We got pushed here, obviously not quite expecting to be pushed here. And I touched on this with just a sentence, but, you know, there's tons of people who can't even be here. You know, we have addressed education, say making education free. If you can get your child to a school, there will be a chair for that child. We will send buses to get your children to bring them to the school, for instance. But that people's access to what we're doing, you know, in many cases, there's just not even a possibility for them to have an access to this. I have a family member who teaches at-risk kids. I mean, as a parent myself, I'd say all kids are at risk at some point or another. The kids that she works with have been kicked out of several schools, and she's the last stop on the very last block. And when the pandemic hit, most of these kids had no access to in many cases, the only stable thing. And their big struggle was getting them onto this, onto technology and getting this. I mean, some people don't have electricity at home, right? So there are the challenges that we face are everything from, you know, who gets online, once online, who controls the access to this. So we have public protections in place for things like real world education or real world access, things you can and cannot do. Those same things have not gone into the digital space, where it's corporations and not governments that are looking at what people can and cannot do. It's a super huge and thorny challenge, I'm you know, to say the least.
I've often spoken about the rapid impact of technology on humanity in its current form is almost unfathomable, undealable with by our current societies and our current governments. You know, it used to go a few hundred years ago, technology was always been around since going back to the beginning. We harnessed fire and farming and writing on walls to share knowledge over generations. And even in the last 100 years, as we've begun to discover flight, etc., those impacts would take a generation to change our society. With the acceleration of technology now, with the computing technology, it takes about I would like to say it takes a couple of years, but it actually takes a couple of minutes for an idea to launch and a platform to spread out and an entire generation to switch to moving something else. And that pivot is moving quicker than we can adapt the ways that we want to live in our current, physical realities, let alone what we're going to do in our digital realities. And so I don't think we can slow it down, but I think we need to give our children the ability to adapt into these new forms so that they can become more open to it. One thing you just mentioned, though, is the idea of what our current reality is very much focused on not only our understanding of our access to technology, but also our geography. And our geography being in the country that we're in. Some of us are in very liberal countries, some of us are very conservative countries, some of us are countries that we are feeling like 100 years in the past compared to where we are now. And so that not only is the access to technology, but the idea of what is good and what is bad and what is culturally important is very different. The digitization of the pandemic, as all of us has become digital humans, I think has been wonderful to take away boundaries. I don't know where you are in the world right now, but we are connecting as if we are right here together, but you are bound by the laws of the country that you're in. So as we move from, bounded by physical locations to the metaverse, which isn't, how do we bring the best of humanity and democracy, well, if you believe in democracy, into this next platform? Ryan, I think you and I were talking very much about trying to make that, to bring the best into it, to keep it open.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot about emergent behavior, right? I think we can't really predict how people will use it, but we can give them the tools to empower them. We can give them the tools to represent themselves. We can give them the tools to express themselves in the way that is authentic to them and their culture. And then we can see the emergent behavior that arises from that. I think when it's being used at scale, we have moderation issues that we need to think about. Right now, social media is at scale and they're failing at moderation. In a lot of ways, they're not taking the responsibility of the platform that they are. And on one side, you can lean towards censorship, right? And nobody wants that. So we have to think these problems at scale when people, both good and bad actors, have the freedom to use these tools the way that they want to. I think we need to incentivize good behavior and disincentivize bad behavior and unharmful behavior. But there's an incredible room for improvement from what we have now. And I just believe that, if you give people the tools and you empower them to make decisions, they will make decisions that are authentic to them and their culture. And you will see the better angels come from people. And then you just try to, as much as you can, mitigate and disincentivize the behavior that ends up becoming toxic.
Yeah, the good and bad thing I always struggle with personally, because I feel it's so much about your context and your point of view on the world of what you believe is good and bad. And then we want to put our values onto other cultures and countries and beliefs and religions and anything else. And I do think over time we're balancing, I hope we will balance out into an equilibrium of a positive society that has all very similar values, but we are in an incredible pressure cooker at the moment because of that access to knowledge that is spreading and bleeding into each other's countries, let alone look at the United States, where you would imagine there'd be some equilibrium, but it's split down the middle, straight down the middle. Half vehemently believe in this, half vehemently believe in that. So either you put them into a space and say, well, you have to coexist because there are some core values, or you end up with two that are separate and those people live in their own versions. And I guess the digital, metaverse can quite easily create spaces to allow niche communities to have their own belief systems and cultures inside of it. We talked a little bit the other day about how democracy could exist within the metaverse, and whether we would want to bring that in. Irina, is there anything in your studies over the last few years that could maybe shine a light onto that?
Absolutely. I mean, there are certain things that I think we need to keep in mind when we talk about the speed of change, is that technology might change quickly and some of our habits and behaviors might change relatively quickly. But what we think and who we are and the assumptions we make change a lot slower. And that's why you see the same sort of things reproduced over and over again, except in Metaverse. The same attitudes, the same what you might construe good or bad behavior, depending on your point of view. And I mean, I think I want to come back to Brenda's point that access and geography, and just the fact that when you bring things online, not everybody makes it. When you do innovation, not everybody makes it. So when you do things democratically, not everybody gets to participate in that version of democracy, in that version of being a part of something. So there's always a question with any new innovation, with any new effort, is who's going to lose and who's going to win, and can we live with the losses? Because nothing's win-win for everyone. In the work that we've done with Virtue, we've worked a lot with notions of values and ethics, and how do you build technologies and take into account values and ethics when really, and we work with startups, when really the wiggle room is tiny. The wiggle room is in between survival and not surviving at all, between getting the funding and not getting the funding, between kind of launching a concept and not. And so we had this, there's an overwhelming sense of just discomfort from the people that are building these technologies and building up these startups. So we don't know how the future is going to come out. We don't know whether we're going to be the cause of the next horrible thing or the next bad thing. How do you know, or the next best thing? How do you know how technological decisions are going to play out? And different people have different ways of doing it. But what we found was there's this lack of, like, how do you know? And are there ways of thinking more broadly? Are there ways of thinking about the future? Because you know how you talked about short-sighted ideas? We didn't know when we invented the internet that it would end up in Snapchat or Instagram. We always have short-sighted ideas about the future. All the future ideation, it's always a little bit tied to our now, because we don't change that much. And so the question is always how what I am is going to affect what I create, and how is that going to affect the people who are not like me. And the unfortunate thing is that suddenly we have this access to scale. We can have amazing and really positive ideas about what we're going to do, and we forget that every positive idea has a negative aspect to it. That when we want to support and empower people to express their opinions and their ideas, but we forget that we may not actually be so in agreement with a lot of the ideas that get expressed. We might actually not like the kinds of empowerment that results. You're going to empower something, you best accept that there are going to be all kinds. Because in the end, people are going to do people things. And relationships and realities are messy. They're much messier than what we want them to be. So if we're going to think about values, we have to acknowledge that somebody's always going to lose, and we best understand who that's going to be, and are we willing to live with the losses? And that's the hard part.
Absolutely. I think in all of this period, I've noticed that the light, although is shining onto our future of these new technologies for us to step forward, but it's really shining on a light on who we are now in our current reality, and the struggles and strains that we have every day, let alone, if we talk about one of the big things everyone's excited about, digital economy. Bitcoin breaks the banks. It's a new form. It's democratized, and we're going to have that as the backbone of our metaverse platforms, whatever you want it going to be. But if you look at the shock of Amazon's done to our current fabric of our current retail state, that every center, every town center and every town in the world is dying because their retail outfits can't fix. We had 2 full yesterday with 26,000 jobs going in the UK. And so Amazon came in, new technology, new platform came in, let alone the pandemic was an enabler to allow us to keep operating in some ways as a positive. But we couldn't adapt with that current system to move into it. As we move into this digital economy in this area, is there anything, Ryan, that we should specifically think about, what this enables for us? Because I guess a lot of people are thinking about, well, I'm a business, I should move into the metaverse. How do I represent myself? Do I end up with a digital twin of my bricks and mortar? Do I have a new storefront? How do I sell things? Are they physical clothes, or do I sell digital clothes for avatar? Like, there's a whole bunch of stuff people are looking at the moment.
Yeah, so one thing that's been proven this year is that gaming is sort of beginning to eat culture. It's not just video games anymore, right? It's these shared spaces where people are spending a lot of time together, even more in 2020 when there's not very many physical options. And we've also seen that gaming as an industry is pretty anti-fragile to something like a pandemic. When everybody's locked down, they have more screen time, and they're trying to recreate a lot of what they do in their life through these available options. And a game like Fortnite and League of Legends, they've proven what I call direct to avatar commerce, right? This idea that a huge part of the revenue of these businesses is actually selling fully digital items and skins to end users that are avatars. And there's no reason to believe that Fortnite or Epic are the only ones that can make billions selling skins. And I think there's a shift in the mindset of the boardroom right now in realizing that. And so we're going to go through somewhat of a similar shift as direct to consumer, where certain parts of the supply chain were removed. It was made more efficient, and products were sent directly to the door of the customer. I think of direct to avatar as kind of removing even more parts of the supply chain. The digital supply chain stays digital. It doesn't always need to go to a physical product. And so your end user, the front door, is basically the avatar persona in many senses that people are using for their game. But the entire online digital persona will be viable for this. And I think we're seeing fashion go through this right now. A lot of streetwear brands and luxury fashion companies are trying to figure out that they've been sitting on these Clo assets, for years. And really, it's only been used internally. It hasn't been a source of revenue. And so with Crucible, we're kind of taking an approach to provide the technology that gives a very secure, path and direct channel to that user, which is an avatar, so that these companies can begin to think about their shift into direct avatar.
Absolutely. I mean, Irina, Brenda, do you want to follow up on that at all?
I'm certainly not surprised to hear it, obviously. I think the challenge that I see with user created content, obviously, and I know that, corporate created content is one thing. User created content is still another. That, when often there's a line, a friend of mine, she wrote a book called Gender Inclusive Game Design, and her Sherry Grainer is her name, and it's a fantastic book. I recommend it. She had this line that I've heard her say several times: if you give them tools, they will build penises. And there's examples throughout technology where, if people have the ability to make something, that's what they make. Mm-hmm. And you can see that even when people have whiteboards, leave a Sharpie there, walk away for an hour. So I do think corporate created content, that doesn't surprise me. I know that certainly game virtual worlds, as designers, we have a lot of experience at this, and going back many years. But there needs to be a heavy degree of moderation on that.
Absolutely. I mean, if you remember, the TV show Silicon Valley had TTD, just time to dick. It was a specific algorithm that they realized they could count and measure it. This is how quickly humanity would get to doing that.
Yeah.
And it is a challenge. I mean, maybe that's another jumping off point. Was if we are looking at moderation or censorship or anything else, privacy and security about who I am and how I am represented and what my data does it becomes even sharper into view. I think we're quite comfortable, in quotes, that we understand that our data is being mined by the social media platforms, and that's kind of the gateway, and that's what we're swapping from. And I kind of like being advertised, welly boots at the moment, because I want a set of boots. But when we step into this additional layer, there is two things. A, what is happening with our data while we're there, and who's using it and tracking it and analyzing it. And then also, how do we understand what's being represented is us, or is the person we're talking to. You know, it's very easy to wear a different skin, representation, voice, everything else. And we assume that there is, you know, the fictional avatar of ourselves, who's a caricature or anything else. And in most games, we feel that they're not really us. And then we are stepping closer to more real representations of it. And in this sense, we hope that you trust that what you see is, you know, the real version of me. But in reality, I'm not there. I put a different background on because I was in a smaller room in my house. And I never told anyone that. I just placed it on. I mean, it's not as bad as I could put a digital hat on as well if I wanted. I mean, that's less good to represent myself. But even in this platform, there's a whole bunch of interesting adornments and adjustments that happen to our representation. So in these other platforms we move over to, is there stuff we need to think about how we would control that, or, you know, access that or flag that to the people that we're working or, you know, communicating with? Any of the above? I'm sure you've all got opinions on it. Maybe Irina, you could jump in.
Well, I mean, there's always a question. If it's about representing yourself, then there's a question of who gets to control that and what are the options. And Brenda had fantastic content about that in her keynote when she talked about how can you represent yourself? And there's, you know, that depends on whoever created the particular platform and the kinds of options they give you. You may or may not be able to represent yourself in the way you want. I think there's always, you know, we always represent ourselves. You wake up in the morning and think what you're going to wear. It's a form of representation. Are you going to put on makeup? Are you going to put on jewelry? What? How? When you make a decision about purchasing anything, it's all about presenting yourself. We're all communicating all the time, you know, by all our choices, whether it's a haircut or a tattoo or anything else. So representation is always there. But then the question is, who makes the choices and what are those choices and what can we make with those choices and those options that are made available to us? So yeah, I mean, it's true that in a gaming situation, like in a metaverse that's a World of Warcraft, I can misrepresent myself and change and gender and age and what have you. Okay, and that might be important, it might not be important, depending on what our goals are in terms of what we're trying to achieve communicating.
I guess it's quite explicit that this was a fictional environment, and we want you to own a representation of a different character, a true avatar. We're not asking you to be yourself within that space. And I know other games are very different, but Brenda, specifically in your kind of background of all the titles, and obviously gaming often lives in the fantasy realm, in the fictional realm, and then you ask, how do you get the explicit contract between someone coming into the space to know how they should kind of convey themselves?
Well, so just to be clear, are you talking about how they should convey themselves once they've created their avatar, you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
on the way in.
When people create their avatar, I mean, even before they get to that mark, it's interesting because the next time you go out in the real world, take a look at the people you see and ask, can I make that person in a virtual world? The decisions about who we can or cannot make in a virtual world are almost always controlled by money. So for instance, if somebody's in a wheelchair, can you make that person in a virtual world? And the odds are no. And if you say, that's it, I want a person, I want a wheelchair, I want characters who are able to be in wheelchairs in a virtual world, these decisions are based on money in many cases, not based on, well, it's the right thing to do. Because if our decisions were based on, I mean, it is after all the technology industry, not the technology movement, right? So that in itself is an issue. Now, when people get inside of worlds, the rules are controlled by companies about, and I think, in fact, as easy as it is to talk about that, And as easy as it is to say, well, geez, companies just need to change the way they do things. I do know, for instance, if we take a look at, say, Ultima Online, when Ultima Online first released, one of the first issues that they had two issues they were not expecting. And it came as a great surprise to everybody. The oldest profession almost immediately appeared in the game. There was prostitution. There was no means for there to be prostitution in the game. No mechanics, nothing that anybody had ever thought of. But nonetheless, people did that. Other virtual worlds like Habbo Hotel also encountered prostitution. So they very quickly banned all words associated with it. So you could type whatever you wanted, but it wasn't coming through. So people started babboing, and they created words to allow this to happen. There was also player killing in Ultima Online. So when you have a safe space of the town, and when you go outside the safe space, you're now exploring. Except very quickly, other people discovered, why do I have to explore when I can just kill the new players when they come out and take their stuff from them? And so the people who are creating this technology are often surprised by the emergent behavior that arises in the technology. We are fairly early into this thing. So we're in games. I think we are fortunate in that because we have virtual worlds, we can create a whole fantastical array of things for people to be. These are corporate controlled worlds. So if we don't like what you're doing, and community management is it's now a field in games that people go into. You can be banned from the community, and you will be banned again and again, and they follow IPs, and eventually that behavior will get better. As a user, we also have choice. So for instance, I can choose to play with voice or without. I think if anybody who has played online in a virtual world, especially if it's a highly competitive virtual world, having a female voice is not one of the voices that you want to have. So I know a number of women who play online a lot who do what I do. So I can talk in a much lower voice if I need to. And I didn't press a button to do that. I just am fortunate to have a low voice. But there's all kinds of, it's a really broad question, and I know I've rambled for an answer, but it's a challenge, and this isn't even getting into the issues of intersectionality that what if somebody is in a wheelchair and they're gay and they're mixed race? We as humans are a wonderfully diverse rainbow, and that rainbow has not fully been considered. And we're in a race to catch up.
It is, I think this is the overarching thing I've discovered from all of my conversations, which bleed away from the corporate one, is that humanity is a very messy thing. It is naturally evolving in all directions over its entire history, and we're beginning to harness technologies in ways that we didn't even think we would. And it's going to be just as messy. And we hope that we will bring some positivity into this, that the good things will prevail and the bad things will fall away or become more niche or go to places where bad people want to hang out. But I guess the final question, because we've only got a couple of minutes left, is there hope? Is there this feels like quite a negative conversation. We're talking about all the challenges, but is there a positive to take forward? Are we hopeful that the metaverse will be a positive impact on our society? During the pandemic, it definitely feels like it's had an opportunity to connect us and has built a decent bedrock. But are you all individually positive towards what the metaverse will be?
Yeah, I think what we're talking about is very significant. We're talking about the sort of next shift as a network species, right, globally. And it would be naive to expect that everything is going to go right? There are people that will be trolls, people will draw penises, swastikas, right? Everything, all the behavior that people have done in the past, I'm sure they will bring it into this. And I think we have the responsibility to go into that with open eyes and learn from the past, but not shy away from the opportunity that we have. Specifically, with the UK, this is a huge advantage for a post-Brexit UK, right? To have a strong gaming industry, to sort of look at where we're going and use it as sort of an asset and make choices around data. You know, the UK has made a lot of right choices around, you know, the end users protections and things like that. And that's really the bedrock for, I think, the, you know, the way that we should move forward is going back to this idea that the internet is for the end user, you know, and somewhere around like Web 2, because of this, you know, business model of advertising, the internet very much did not become for the end user. And that's not what it is right now, but the metaverse can be. And the layer of that being established is actually a far bigger economy with more monetization worth trillions. And it's a big, significant opportunity that I think that we should think about all of the sort of negative things that can happen, but we should very much, you know, sort of go at it with an optimistic attitude, try to mitigate as much of the bad as we can, but also, you know, try to do things as right as we can moving forward for as many people in the world that will have access to it.
Very succinct, Ryan. Thank you. I think we're out of time, sadly. I think I'd love to just continue talking to you guys for the rest of the day. In fact, we're going to pop over to the other session room for a Q&A. So anyone who wants to continue the conversation with us directly, you're more welcome to use the Hop-In platform and come and find us, and we'll carry on there. But just to say thank you so much, Irina, Ryan, Brenda, for having some of the tougher topics to talk about, you know, but I think it's incredibly important for all of us to at least have those moments to talk about what is important for ourselves and really what is important for humanity and valuable, really truly valuable to us as individuals, not only to be bewildered by the impact of so many corporate pressures down on ourselves, and just find some truth. And thank you, Beyond, for allowing us to have this conversation in public. I think it's a very important thing. So see you all very soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Ryan.
Hey there. Are we in a room now, publicly?
We are in a public room, and there's just us three.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
exactly the same, but with less people listening to us.
All right.
Oh, dear.
All right.
Well, we may be joined by some public, and if we do, we can ask them some questions, or they can ask us some questions. I didn't get around to talking about it, but Macron came out very recently saying that when Obama stopped pushing democracy and pushing US values, he made a thing of like, we need to stop putting US values out into the world because that's causing the world to become a worse place. Macron said last week that he believes that that was a fundamental mistake, that liberalism is on the decline because we're not fighting back, in quotes. And he wants the EU values to be pushed out into the world because they're better values. And so like a crusade is almost out, not a religious crusade, but a crusade about, you know, democratic values being pushed out because the US has left a void, which I thought was an incredibly bold thing to say. Very French, you know, putting but again, you know, what we were talking about a minute ago about what values are important and what, you know, what we believe to be good, I always find as the biggest challenge that I fall back onto anyway, because my personal views are clouded by my reality.
I noticed,
I don't.
Oh, sorry, Ryan.
Sorry, go ahead, Brenda.
I just noticed that there's a question actually in the chat. Which Facebook seems like an untrustworthy gatekeeper from a privacy perspective, demanding a Facebook login to use Quest 2 and their immersive environments. Does corporate control stifle online metaverse communities? And how should corporate entities balance this power?
That's a good one.
And for anybody who's listening, if you have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat because we can see them and then we can discuss them. So I read it, so one of you can take it.
Sure. Yeah, so I think what you're going to find more and more is that every company is starting to think about this proprietarily, right? They're thinking in-house. What does the metaverse mean for me? How does it benefit my users, my shareholders? And if you follow that line of thought, it leads to the fact that they believe that they're going to build their metaverse, right? And so you have this like real disconnect in the definition of what it is. I personally believe there's one metaverse and there's different satellites in that ecosystem. And it's sort of the collection of all of it that makes the metaverse. But I think that you're going to find that a lot of executives or projects kind of will refer to their metaverse, you know, or what I kind of think more of like a monoverse, right? Which is just kind of a bigger three-dimensional platform. So Facebook is a great example. They actually might not even think they're building the metaverse. I think they just want to continue to move to the next phase of computing. They tried to do it with mobile and failed a few times, and then they got Oculus. So this is the way that they believe that they're going to move forward. But there are a lot of, you know, that think that they're creating their private metaverse. And I think over time, you're going to see that there will be an open platform option. People have access to choose that. And my hope and belief is that that starts to become bigger and swallow up closed systems. And if you want to stay closed and just sort of lord over your kingdom on your own, then there's a ceiling to that. You know, and you can continue to kind of position yourself outside of everything that's happening in the open platform. But I believe that if we create another option that is just as well designed, you know, as some of the closed options right now, a surprising amount of people will move over and choose that. So I think Facebook's going to just keep doing Facebook, you know, and each company is going to keep trying to keep it into their account system so that it becomes proprietary for them.
One of the challenges we were talking about the other day, Ryan, about Facebook, specifically having the login, is, you know, they want to track our data. And it used to be very much, you know, not only are they tracking, you know, and scanning what we write and who we write to and what images we post, and they're analyzing all of that. And they do, you know, follow how quickly we scan past things to analyze our dwell time on different images. But in VR, the additional collection of our physicality, you know, when you put on an Oculus Quest headset, it knows your height from the ground. So it knows how tall you are immediately as an additional data point to add into its database and connect with. And then it can also track your positional movement, your mannerisms, how your body mechanics work. And with the hands, there's a huge amount of sudden data of who you are. USC did a white paper, I think it was about a month ago now, saying that from that data, just head and hands, they can recognize with kind of 97% accuracy you know, within about 10 seconds of data collection, because that,
and predict your behavior,
which is a digital fingerprint. You know, it's collecting that sort of stuff on top of it. So not even, you wouldn't need a login. If your Facebook had access to a multiplayer game on a different system, they could recognize it's you without them needing access to anything else. They're like, we've collected that digital fingerprint, we know it's you. And I think the other thing that was quite worrying or interesting and scary about that is that same paper was connected to a study to look at being able to look on early onset Alzheimer's. And so with certain studies, there are certain telltale signs in our physicality in earlier years prior to, you know, it being a major disability that can give, you know, well, we think you're going to go down that path. And so with that data, you can, you know, get some intervention. It's an amazing thing. You could also sell that data to insurance companies and check you off the ability to get health insurance. And I think that was one of the scariest things when you start thinking about the data set and how it's then utilized outside of the platform to somewhere else.
Yeah, actually, so to add to that, it gets more scary when it comes to VR and AR, because there's eye tracking, which gives almost real-time directional data on your brain. It could go into your health. It could go into like what you're predisposed for, what your orientations are. You probably won't be able to see this, but I have this image here, which shows you all the things that you can derive from eye tracking data.
Wow.
And I think the question really becomes like, do we want any company or any entity to have that level of data on us to be able to run those predictions, especially one that has demonstrated that through their business model doesn't look out for our best interest? You know, and I'm not even picking on Facebook. I'm picking on the entire mental model in which this economy is built on right now.
Harvey follows up saying GDPR 2 for our physicality and our digital data, I guess, would come into it. You know, GDPR has done.
Well, GDPR includes it already.
Yeah.
GDPR absolutely includes height. It's personal data. It's just this, especially because GDPR doesn't have a specific definition of personal data. It's any data that can lead to identifying a person. If it's height, then it's height. We don't need GDPR too. We already have it in GDPR.
It's personal identifying information. Yeah.
But I wanted to move us towards the question by Sally Charles, who asks Brenda specifically that you spoke about women's opinions being valued 20% less if they were known to be from women. I think that's the GitHub study.
It was. Yeah.
Is there conflict between being seen as who we are and being heard for what we think?
Absolutely. There's a massive issue there. One of the things that have been engaged in is an archaeological dig, basically, of women in early computing and women in early games. And women, it's become a greater challenge because women would, in some cases, actually identify themselves by, for instance, their name was T. Chang. Is that Tom or Tina, right? Or, something entirely different. And so women would, in early games, in some cases, obfuscate their identity. Or if their identity was known, for instance, those women would often be relegated to the role of, well, she was helping her husband who was coding. When, that's not always the case. My husband is also a game developer. And on multiple occasions, I have been, so you do PR or and in one case, I actually was at a press company. It was a game press company. And they said, oh, you're PR. So I decided to play along and I didn't correct them. And so, it was interesting to me to watch how I was treated. And that was just their basic assumption instead of the fact that I was a developer as well. So yeah, it's a huge issue. I mean, it goes to me, the whole notion, I will consider it 100% lip service, and I would put a strong adjective in front of lip service, but I don't know whether I can swear. So just pick your favorite swear word and put it in front of, I would consider it something lip service until I see the boards of companies looking like the people that they say they're going to serve. And when people of color, when people who have different intersections of identity, when people, LGBTQI folks, when women, when trans folks, when the boards of companies match the audiences that they say they want to serve, I'll start to believe it then. Until then, I don't.
Absolutely. Sally followed up saying J.K. Rowling.
And the disabled. I just caught, yes, Mark, thank you for adding that.
J.K. Rowling was advised to use her initials by her publisher because they thought boys would not buy the books of a woman. I mean, it leans back to so many early writers using synonyms, using an alternative version to be able to publish because, it's been in the fabric of society for too long.
Well, I also think it can't be overstated how much of followers the corporate mindset is. When I first landed in LA, I was working in Hollywood a lot. And like the common thing you would hear is that, women-led films don't make money in the box office. And that wasn't that long ago. And that was the sort of that was the executive opinion on that. And then you had movies that were women-led that made a lot of money, and now everybody's pattern matching to that thing, right? So they very much are just followers to the sort of the profit, and so even though they might say those things, and this is an obvious thing to say, it doesn't make it true, right? And so I think with something new like the metaverse, we have the opportunity to just say, that's okay, you don't see it, and just go for it anyways, and then the market will turn most of those people that just make, profit-driven decisions. And so it's really important that every single type of person in the dynamic range of humanity does have access to the tools so that they can express and represent themselves within these spaces. Because it is just obvious to me that some of them are going to be exceptional and some of them are going to make huge things that become great business successes. And then the market will change, and executives who make boardroom decisions will think differently about that. So I think that it is really important to have, not just to check the box off of diversity, but to like really find a way to represent all the different kinds of people, because they represent a lot more of the market from a business perspective that's being untapped right now.
I think I agree with you, Ryan, on the fact that there's certainly a percentage of the market that's never being represented by the market decisions that are made. I would disagree with you that there's a following, that the market will just follow. The market seems to make a lot of decisions that are rather detrimental to its baseline by sort of just excluding half the people quite a lot of the time from as possible consumers of particular products and services. So I think there's a lot to be said about sort of the inherent set of fairly deeply embedded assumptions about who our consumers ought to be and where the source of the money is, that don't entirely follow the kind of rationality of the market that we sort of want to expect.
I mean, we can all vote with our wallet very easily to change our well, not easily. The ability to have impact on corporations is about where you spend. If we change our
I think yes.
Pardon?
But have you tried to quit Google lately?
I haven't. I kind of like Google. I have quit Facebook though, and that was a few years ago.
Try quitting Amazon.
That's a difficult one.
It's interesting here in Ireland. So we are actually in a quitting Amazon scenario, which sounds odd, right? But there is no Amazon shipping hub in Ireland. All of our Amazon stuff comes from the UK. Brexit now means all of that is going through customs. So the good news about that, and in already some interesting news, is that we tend to shop local anyway, just because it takes a couple of days, not everything ships. And so I do feel that while certainly Amazon has hurt the local economy, it hasn't hurt it as much. And I do think the fact that that things are going to have to go through, this whole extra level can mean a good thing for the local economy. Just in case it's certainly not clear from my accent, but I live in Ireland and have for quite some time.
I mean, the only thing to think about that is that Amazon is headquartered in Ireland for tax reasons. They have
most companies have their European headquarters here.
Yeah.
I see there's a question, so I'll read it out here. Despite the hegemonic nature of representation in video games and game spaces, why do usually white cis male gamers sometimes feel like their identities or spaces are under attack or react so strongly when characters or representations exist outside of this demographic? An example being Abby in The Last of Us 2, whose strength and physical attributes angered a lot of players. How do we resolve this? I don't know. I think I can't speak for a lot of game developers. I'll speak for myself. It's baffling. I believe in general that when we talk about wanting diverse characters in games or wanting to diversify workspaces, let's just say that there are 20 chairs that we're looking at. And those 20 chairs are filled by white cis men. Nobody's coming for those 20 chairs. Those 20 chairs can stay. People just want 20 other chairs. And there's 20 other chairs. They want to see characters like that. It's interesting to me that this happens. I do find it happens less. I do find that these voices, just like if somebody were standing outside my window yelling lasagna, I might look at them like, what are you doing? Why are you outside my window yelling such weird things? I think these voices are less. I think these voices are, I think these voices are just, how do I say, they're yelling into a void, really. I know that in the last 4 years, when I go to pitch games, when I'm trying to get when I'm looking at having a new game made, I'm asked by publishers, can you play as a female? Can you play, and on and on and on. And I've actually gone one step further and just entirely removed gender from my game. You can play as whoever the hell you want to play as, wherever you want to fall on that scale or off the scale. It doesn't matter to me. So I'm seeing publishers wanting to put a lot more diversity into the world, and I think that's a good thing. But it is an interesting thing, and this whole conversation reminds me of something that used to baffle me even 10 years ago. There was a very well-regarded game developer. Her name was Roberta Williams, and she's largely credited with creating the very first adventure games. Created a company called Sierra Online. Many women who are in games look up to her, and when she finished her last game, she just disappeared, man. That was it. No interviews. And she's done rare interviews since then, but no interviews, no online presence really of any kind. And I remember thinking, why would you do that? Why would you just disappear? But I have to say that after the pandemic, after being online in every form of social media, after being, called out, trolled, everything else, that I am very likely to be one of those people who chooses reality, regardless of what metaverse or betterverse is built.
Absolutely.
I get it now.
I think the digital detox is becoming, a huge area. Turning everything off and going back to the wild. I grew up as a new age hippie in a commune, a traveling community. We didn't have a fixed abode until I was 9 or 10, and there was no running water or electricity. You just lived wherever you're going to live, and you engaged in a very different way. Which meant when we settled down, I rebelled and went really straight and started a tech company. Black sheep of the family. But I think not many people have had that view of how you can live differently. We just can get railroaded down this path that I think Ryan and I were talking the other day about. The illusion of democracy and freedom is an incredibly comfy prison. It looks free, but actually it's just the rails are soft and squidgy to nudge you all the way along. And when people try and move outside of it, it's very difficult. Question for Irina. I think the digital fingerprints should belong to the user they represent. Do you think that the user would have more faith in the big corporations and feel safer online if they own this data as well? Is this even feasible?
I like this question, and I like the last part of it. Is this even feasible? Because we talked a little bit earlier about how just about anything about you can be connected to you or being used to identify who you are. So there's a question between sort of me and my identity and how I prove to others who I am, which is why Facebook's offering and Google offer ways of log in with your account to various online settings, right? It's an identity management thing. And then there's this notion of fingerprinting. Now, my browser has a fingerprint, and if I use this computer, then that fingerprint gets identified. If I use a different computer, it's a different fingerprint. So on the one hand, there's a question of what do we mean by fingerprints and what is it that we're supposed to be owning? On the other hand, there's a question of what does it mean to own? Because a lot of times, I live in Denmark, and in Denmark, the vast majority of municipal services are online. A friend of mine does all the municipal services for her grandmother. She pretends she's her grandmother, she logs in, and she does all the municipal services stuff because her grandmother couldn't be bothered with trying to figure out how to use the website and whatever. Now that requires my friend to be able to have those fingerprints and identifications to be able to do that for somebody. We actually do things for each other. Having something own, having us own the fingerprints. How do we then do that kind of relational stuff for each other? What does it mean to own? And what does it mean to have that? Because I think there's part of the reason why we're worried about corporates having data about us is a question of like, okay, what does that mean? If you know something about me, I can perhaps negotiate what that relationship means. Perhaps with my government, I have some sense of what are their obligations toward me and my obligations towards them and the kinds of data that we exchange. But what are the obligations of a random corporation that knows a bunch of stuff about me that I don't even know, What are their obligations toward me? How do I engage with that? No, owning my fingerprint, I don't think is going to change that. We need to rethink, what does it mean to have all of these relations with all of these companies? What are their obligations? Who's going to hold them to account? Then that's kind of the source of the anxiety. Yeah, we own a lot of our logins and passwords. They are personal private data to some extent. But what that means, I think, is something we need to consider.
Good. Catherine says, as a female gamer, these voices are often aimed at females online. Abuse is often hurled for simply being female, particularly in online games. How do you think the industry can change the way female players are perceived by the gaming community?
I do think that, at first and foremost, Catherine, she's speaking the truth there. There's no doubt about that. I think there are some things. So in the wild days, like even early League of Legends, Riot did a lot of work in community management in trying to turn around toxic communities. I do know that that at game conferences, one of the biggest topics is in fact this, like how do you manage communities and keep those communities positive spaces. So it's an issue that people are actively trying to tackle. Currently it is through banning, just totally nuking players' accounts and getting rid of them. I often wish there were, some kind of overall community score, because it's really easy for somebody who is, hell-bent on creating a toxic community to go from A to B and just be the exact same type of person, or, to create a new account, say, although there's, chaining accounts together, some of that is being known. I still do find that there is largely this perception that even though women own more consoles than men, even though the average gamer is a 40, or the last data I had was a 43-year-old woman, there is this notion of like, are you a real gamer, right? And I remember even going into a game retail space, I won't say which one, but going into a game retail space, and I don't even remember what I was looking for, but they said, well, what console does your son have? So I said, I'm a game developer. I have every console, it's for me. And, I still find that and even the notion, and I've heard from college lecturers, that women just tend not to like tech, despite the fact that women invented programming, and invented the most hardcore programming principles. So I think for now, it is down to community curation. And I think that's absolutely critical. It is the biggest issue that we are seeing across the metaverse, game, whatever, is content, community creation. There's loads of people who can be incredibly brave behind an avatar that is not them.
Yeah. I mean, I get one point and one question is, do we think that the change in, do we think that things are getting better as younger generations are growing up with these communities and access to these technologies and aren't bound by old ways of thinking and being, which is kind of more generational? And then, case in point, my little sister, my stepsister, she's old, she's 18 now, but she was 15, obviously 3 years ago. And my dad said, oh, how's she doing at school? Because she's super nerdy. She's into cosplay. She's a big geek, big gamer, wonderful human being. Like, how's she doing at school? She's being bullied, obviously, because that's a smaller community within it. And he was like, no, she runs the fucking place. Like, she's heralded as, at the moment, the zeitgeist of society is, future tech, engage with digital platforms in a way that she'll be building the future. If you're the jock at school, your time is up. You're not going to survive in this next generation, this next community, this next society. And in fact, it's hard pivoted around that they are, heralded and supported. 3 years later, she's actually off to university doing political studies or something like that. I was hoping she would get into games, but she's doing politics. But I thought it was really interesting that there is a shift, natural evolutionary shift coming underneath that will push out these old ways, even if some of the old ways of thinking are stuck. You know, I've often said it about some of the political views is, well, you know, at some point those people will pass away and those old values will actually go because, you know, humanity will refresh itself.
Yeah, I do think that I certainly do think that there is a degree of that. I mean, but we have there are some systemic problems that we do have. Like when I graduated school and my degree was a mix of computer science and writing, so tech communications, half science, half writing about that science. The graduating class was, you know, at that point in time was roughly 30, 33, maybe a third, maybe gusting toward 40% women. And that was the average computer science graduate. Now it's way down. The last time I taught in a university, there was one female student in a group of 50 some. So we have a lot of work to do, And people, you know, people talk a lot about that. I would like to see scholarships offered. I would like to see whatever we can do, because until a representative audience is building that, we are simply not going to have representation. I don't believe we will have representation in virtual worlds.
But it's not just representation. I think there's huge cultural barriers that we need to use. So Nola Talman in the chat has a really nice example of that. You know, she says, my 4-year-old daughter is a gamer. She builds games all the time on apps, and her daycare had her bottle feeding babies while the boys were building. And that's something that you see all the time. I teach an introduction to machine learning course here, and one of the things that comes is, oh yeah, of course, gender is binary. Moving right along, as if that's just sort of built in. It's built into every single book. It's just part of it. There is so much that, of course I'm female. I'll be talking about ethics in the machine learning course. Clearly, that makes sense. There's so much that's built into how we, whether intentionally or not, represent and reproduce these kinds of expectations. And they need to happen. I mean, I think in many ways, computer science and tech development itself is a kind of form of philosophy that makes philosophy real, but forgets it's actually a philosophy. So it actually has an image of a future, a society that it builds, except that image is relatively reduced and rather simplified, and then we have problems. And so I think we need to rethink how we teach computer science, how we think about what are the variables, what is a binary, how do you deal with all these complications from the very start. We're not. Our books are still books from 10 years ago that do exactly the same thing. Oh, look, it's a creditworthiness example in your machine learning algorithm. And obviously, some people are going to be creditworthy and some are not. Here's a binary algorithm that we're going to, and we're going to train a binary classifier on that because that just makes sense. And so now that's how you do it. And you've taught, 100 people to do that. That's okay. Yeah. Right. This is something that's so systemic and so built in, and it's everywhere.
Sally says, and I think this is an interesting, maybe we just need to create a playpen for those people so they can be happy together and let the rest of us get on with the Metaverse. And it's an interesting thing. Can we create spaces for different points of view which are, walled off? Is that a better way of dealing with it and saying, well, you can in this space be like that because that is your type of people? And I think that's a real challenge about whether you put walls up, whether the countries raise their drawbridges. We are with, a Brexit thing at the moment. We're pulling up the drawbridge and saying, well, this is our sovereignty and we want to operate and control our borders and our values and our everything else. But really we're saying we don't want to cross-pollinate as much. And I think that if you did throw a playpen up, as you say, I think it would be I don't know. It depends. I don't think it would be the best approach.
I think it would. I don't think it would work in a sense, right? Like if we go back a few years ago when Gamergate was at its height, There were, you know, like, I mean, there were those padded cells, right? There, you know, there were places on, you know, 4chan where people would discuss, let's just say that this, let's say this is the better verse.
Yeah.
There were lesser verses there that where people would discuss things, and where people, you know, there was just loads of stuff being discussed, you know, targeted at X hour, we are going to target so-and-so online. And so those padded cells, you know, they're only as well, you know, it doesn't really work. I think we collectively have to decide. I don't know. This is a problem that almost feels, there are loads of things that I feel I can solve, like dragons and warriors and what loot drops are, and you know, nice meaty mathematical problems that come with games. This particular challenge feels beyond my ability to solve.
Absolutely. I think it's what is to be human. And it's, if you get down to it, and that question is not solvable. It is just, you know, everything we do in every way. We, you know, I think, well, actually, here's a point of view. I think the guardrails of religion, community around religions, if you go back to a lot of the core beliefs, is, you know, some really good values and good stories of how to live and operate. And they had a, you know, moderately good impact on the world. And over time, we have now got to a point where the, you know, religions are fading. There's a lot less engagement in the same way because of, you know, the impact of globalization on it. But I do think teaching the good values, whatever they would be, you know, that are, you know, human and that are movable between different societies and different groups of humans, is something we need to address, and how we bring those values through.
I think it will be a challenge, especially the intersection of various cultures. You know, what is considered a good value to some is considered, I mean, there are countries in the world in which LGBTQI folks can be arrested, right? And that's a value. So, you know, that will be a challenge. You know,
and that was the value for the UK 50 years ago, 60 years ago.
Yeah. So I do think we've got our work cut out for us. I eventually believe that there will be people, just like in the real world, we have to decide which spaces we are willing to participate in which spaces that we are just not willing to participate in because our data is being farmed, or because we find it affects our safety or our mental health. And interestingly, like I have 4 kids. As a parent, I feel that I have a leg up because I've been in tech since '81. But nonetheless, I still find myself struggling, as many parents do, with, you know, why won't they get off their phone? Why are they up half the night? Do we have computers in the room or not? To what extent do we use computers? And so, you know, you would think that I do have an advantage in that respect, but they are dealing with something, you know, if they're dealing with something I've not had to deal with. They're growing up with tech I've not had to grow up with. So I'm trying to learn while effectively being a dinosaur in this technological space. It is really it's unprecedented, and I think many of us are learning as we're simultaneously trying to control both its development and its impact.
I don't think we can control it. I think it's just going to happen the same way that steam started the Industrial Revolution, and there were huge swathes of, you know, Luddites wanting to smash the machines because they were changing the fabric of society and how we lived. And I think that as this, you know, our panel was, to just come up a level and have a view of what's happening is important. Whether we can affect it really and change it, because we are dinosaurs, the next generation is going to sweep through pretty quickly. It's a really difficult one. Brian and I were talking the other day about the idea of digital nations and digital citizens, and corporations becoming the next countries. You know, they control their borders of the metaverse comparatively to our physical borders of where we may live in the real world. And I thought that was a really interesting point, that those aren't defined by countries anymore.
Some are, some are not. Actually, about a decade ago, I even wrote a paper about it, about the fact that we tend to think of the internet as this sort of unbounded and borderless space, but there are absolutely borders there. There are absolutely bounds there. I mean, when was the last time you tried to watch a YouTube video that said it's not available in your sector? Geography matters hugely. And what I wrote about was that, you know, country code top level domains actually matter hugely if you're not in the US. And language matters hugely. If you speak English, certainly you have access to a much broader metaverse than if you don't. And if you speak other languages, there are very different kinds of metaverses. Sometimes they're nationally constrained, sometimes they're not, but they're also constrained sometimes geographically in different ways. So absolutely, there are boundaries, there are borders, they are often policed, they're often very much there, and they're policed for different reasons in different ways. So we have an imaginary of it being sort of a free and open space, and it's not, and it's never been. And I think we need to start there. I need to start acknowledging that, and acknowledging the fact that, yes, you have, you know, XP farms in China, and there's a very specific kind of thing that happens there, and you have expectations about how that works. There are national expectations, there are cultural expectations, they are all our presumptions about a different culture and how they ought to act, but they're also performed within these spaces. I looked at Russian internet and Kazakh internet and the Russian-speaking internet, and it was very, very clear how well and how specifically those borders are defined, and how they're often policed.
A little part of me hopes that we end up with a Star Trek universe. Little part.
I see a question here about the metaverse utopia. I think that's actually a really important thing to talk about, because you have to kind of really decide whether you think like a utopia is possible. I don't think a utopia is possible. I think, you know, whatever humanity has brought to things in the past, they will bring to this next thing. I think we can create and design models that better manage and mitigate some of it. But I don't think that there's an environment that we can create, which is called the metaverse, that is just a perfect utopia. I always think, actually, ironically, about this Kissinger quote. And he said there are two types of people that say if you leave people to their own sort of devices, they will devolve into chaos. Or if you leave people and give them the resources that they need, it will become peace. And I think that's a very different mindset in how things are built and how things are managed. And obviously he said it politically. And I think, you know, it speaks a lot to sort of the dictator mindset and the control, but also in capitalism, when you talk to sort of the C-level executives, there's a very clear belief on one of those things. And Silicon Valley started, and why it was so exciting to everybody is because there was this idea of abundance, right? If we connect everybody, if this technology creates more opportunities for people, then we'll have more peace. And I think everybody just sort of has to think about that as they're building, because there's going to be a lot of conflicting ideas around that. But I personally don't think that there is a utopia. I think there can be continuous improvement. I think that we all have a responsibility to make sure that we improve on the things that haven't worked so far. But I don't think that utopia should be the goal.
If we haven't mastered reality, we're not going to master virtual reality.
Not at all.
Remember, in utopia, somebody suffers for everybody else to have a good time.
Might be utopia for that group of people that's like localized in their little, you know, penthouse. One other point and topic I kind of wanted to bring up was actually I don't want to take up more time. Go ahead.
No, go for it, Ryan. I think we're in our kind of final phase anyway, so it'd be good to hear from you.
Well, this idea of interoperability, like, you know, for the metaverse to really shape up, there has to be interoperability. And I think this is really not a technical problem. This is a business right now, interoperability. All of these borders and these things that exist are very much based off of like, you know, a business model or a company. The technical side of this is actually one of the easier things to accomplish. So I think when we think about interoperability and how all of these different cross disciplines and these groups of people and cultures are going to work together, I think we really need to rethink the business models around it.
Hey, Tom.
Hi. Sorry to pop in there. I took what I thought was going to be the end of Ryan's sentence and popped in on the pause. But I just wanted to come in and to just say thank you to you. I mean, thank you to you all. It's been a fantastic morning. Brenda, hello and lovely to meet you, and fantastic. Your opening keynote was superb. And just got the energy flowing this morning and got people thinking and talking. And Irina, thank you so much for stepping in at such a short warning, and doing a remarkable job. Fantastic. Sol, for steering the ship. You know, turbulent waters, but what I realized is that we should have given you much more time. There are so many questions that need to be tied up on this, but what we'll do is we will set up some ongoing discussion. I will be back to chase you all up and to take the conversation forward. And Ryan, just wow, fantastic! And I will have to post. I couldn't keep up with all of the links and stuff, but I will post them up in the record session and make sure that everybody gets all that information.
Awesome. Thanks, Tom.
Right.
Tom, thanks for pulling this all together. It's been a real pleasure to talk about some of the more thorny, interesting subjects around it, not just being bewildered by the technology that everyone gets too excited about.
Yeah, we want to step away from that and just really get back to the human, see what it is that we're dealing with, but who it is that we're dealing with ourselves. You know, we can't go any faster than us.
Yeah, I think it's really difficult to time box this conversation. So Tom, thank you for putting this together. I would love to be a part of an ongoing series of discussions around this. Like I said earlier, I think this is a real advantage for post-Brexit UK. And I think that it's very well positioned to sort of like not take advantage, but really build on this moment. And so I've made my company in the UK intentionally for that. And so I'm more than happy to keep this discussion going.
Well, rest assured, your name is on the list, and there is no escape now. I'm afraid you are locked in. So I will look forward to more of this later on. Okay, we better close up though, and thank you once again, and thank you for all the questions from the audience. It's been a great session, and it'll be on the recorded. Okay. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.